You know, the Resident Evil retrospective started as a fun little idea for me. I thought, hey, maybe I'll blast through a few of my favorite RE games, have some fun, and maybe get a few subscribers. Well, those of you who have been along for the ride know it turned into something much more than that. I started analyzing video output, comparing ports, reviewing spin-offs, the list goes on and on. So it stands to reason that the earlier entries in this series don't exactly live up to my more recent content. In my defense, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I had yet to develop any patterns based on both what you guys and, well, myself wanted out of this. And nowhere is that more evident than in my review of the original Resident Evil. Not only did I give less than 2 minutes to the incredible remake of the game, but I also failed to cover any of its ports. Well, that changes today, people. We're diving headfirst into the wide world of RE1 ports. Yes, all of them. What's up, guys? I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews. Welcome back to the Resident Evil Retrospective. First up in this apology to RE fans masquerading as a video, we have a version of the game that I have always been curious about. My first foray into disc-based gaming came in the form of the PS1, and round about the time I could afford any other consoles, the next generation had already started. Instead of going back and discovering all the goodness I had missed out on, I decided to throw all my savings on a used PS2, and sadly that scenario would keep repeating itself until I met a friend who grew up a hardened Sega fan. After playing the Sega Saturn for the first time in my adult life, I was hooked, and out of the kindness in this guy's heart, he just gave me his Model 2 for free. Since then, I've been struggling to collect games for a console that's pretty damn expensive to get into, but more than that, I have only recently had in my hands a port of one of my absolute favorite games on the console. I'd always kind of known about Sega Saturn's version of RE1, but it remained a mystery to me up until a few months ago, so without further nonsense, let's jump right in. Now, right off the bat, I have to admit, even though I would love to see the US release's gorgeous tall case on my shelf, this is the Japanese release of RE1, but what it lacks in iconic packaging, it more than makes up for in uncensored gore. And I have to say, even though I had seen highly compressed videos online, I never knew how cool this uncensored intro was until I saw it for myself running on real hardware. In retrospect, I think Capcom would have done well to leave these scenes in for the US release, since the gore and blood here is at a high level of quality, or at least much higher than the CG and acting in the game. And if I'm being completely honest, this scene right here would have scared the shit out of me as a kid. I mean, don't get me wrong, RE1 already gave me nightmares, but this half-eaten face right here would have been the perfect cherry on top of a very terrifying cake. Gore aside, there are a few differences to note here, but I'm happy to inform you the classic Resident Evil gameplay remains untouched. The Saturn controller works great with the series' famous tank controls, and nothing feels out of place or ported poorly. Hell, if anything, we have a few improvements to talk about. The auto-aim feature that was left out of the original American release has been implemented, and from what I can tell, the difficulty's been tweaked just a little bit too. I can't quite quantify this, but it felt like it took more hits to drop from fine to caution, and maybe zombies took less bullets too. I'm not sure though. One thing I can be sure about is that load times are noticeably slower. Not only is opening your inventory more of a wait, but door transitions hang a bit longer too. Also, there's something funny going on with the audio. Some sound effects are just a bit off-sounding, kind of like they're in a slightly different key. I have to assume this is a side effect of this stuff not streaming off the disc, but using the Saturn's onboard audio maybe? To be honest, I'm not really sure. I'm not an expert at this kind of stuff. Either way, you're going to notice a few oddities thanks to whatever's to blame. My best example is when I triggered the falling roof in the shotgun room and then deactivated it, but after I left the area I could still hear the gears moving in the background and continued to even hear it in adjacent rooms. Now, it was very faint and I'll have to drastically increase the audio for you guys to hear it, but it was definitely there and kind of cool in a weird sort of way. Of course, there's tons of small alterations made here and there, like the existence of the gold tyrants, an added battle mode, and a few unique costumes, but in my eyes, the most interesting change has to do with the presentation. It's no secret that RE1 was built from the ground up for the PlayStation, and that meant conforming to something that would become an industry standard soon enough. And for those of you that don't know, PlayStation 1 games are modeled around the use of triangles to form 3D objects, whereas the Saturn uses quads. This gives the Saturn version of this game a slightly different look to its 3D models, and a few alterations fans of the original are likely to notice right off the bat. What caught my attention is the more blended nature of the boundaries that make up various parts of a model, and the lack of dithering used in high contrast areas, but that's not to say you won't see any. As most of you know, the Saturn had some odd ideas on how to build gaming hardware, and split operations up between 2 video processors, and it's well known that transparencies weren't exactly its strong suit, so it's no surprise that you're going to see transparent meshes all over get replaced with dithered patterns. However, transparent effects were possible for the Saturn, they just required a few extra workarounds. Setting one layer of graphics as transparent was achievable, but it would negate any layer underneath that transparency. This is best seen in your shadow, which will cancel out any 3D blood effects it overlaps with. And aside from a slight color and brightness shift that comes from just being on new hardware, there's not much else to note. Speedrunners are probably going to want to stay away from this version thanks to the longer load times and less snappy transitions, but for a casual playthrough, this port is actually cool as hell. Sadly, the US version typically keeps its high price on eBay, but if you have the ability to play imports, I'd say the Japanese version is very easy to get through even with no knowledge of the language. Plus the voiceovers are all in English, so you won't be missing out on that sweet 90s voice acting.
Am I poisoned? Give me the serum.
Next up is an interesting port for all the wrong reasons. The Windows 95 release of RE predated the Saturn version and could be seen as the most complete port to date, depending on who you ask. Not only does it have the fully uncensored FMVs, but they're also in color. Now, at first I didn't like the idea of this iconic intro being in anything other than black and white, but after watching it, I gotta say, I really like it. On top of that, we get a clean and crisp 640 by 480 output resolution, which was double what any of the console ports could offer at the time. But this comes at a price. This game is an absolute nightmare to get running on modern hardware, and thanks to conflicting reports, each guide you're going to find will have a different set of instructions to get it up and running. After having a remarkably hard time with this thing, I was ready to give up when, in a last-ditch effort, I decided to contact my go-to guy for these things, Creamy Elephant. Being the savior that he is, he shot me a patched install of the game that he had previously gotten working with Lotus Prince, the guy behind the most comprehensive video covering RE ports that anyone's ever made. But even with his help, I was not out of the woods yet. This new installation of the game required further tinkering and a very specific set of circumstances required for every single startup. And I'd love to say it was all worth it, but, well, let's just get into it. And first up on my list of complaints is the fact that you're going to be locked into using keyboard controls, which isn't as bad as you might think at first, but still not quite ideal. I will admit a program like XPatter would have probably helped out, but the controls weren't so much of an issue that I wanted to go through the effort. And on the opposite side of the coin, there was one good thing that came from all the heartache required to set this thing up. In this version of the game, you can actually skip door animations, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, even a crappy PC at the time was still much faster than a PS1, so this was a cool little feature to have access to. Now don't get me wrong, that short 1-second transition in between rooms adds a boatload to the game's atmosphere, but if you're trying to speedrun the game, I figured this would be a major selling point. Of course, you're going to find a few issues that counter this, likely coming from running such an old game on hardware that would have amounted to a room-sized supercomputer at the time. Right off the bat, I noticed that the game's animations were playing very fast, which would lead to actions being heavily out of sync with the voice acting in long scenes.
It's me too.
Now it's Wesker's time to disappear. I don't know what's going on.
Now, I'm sure there's a driver set I could use to fix this, but once I finally found a configuration that actually booted, the last thing I wanted to do was make changes. I also noticed that audio files included with this version seemed to be of pretty poor quality. While music was playing, I could actually hear the audible hiss that comes with low bitrate playback, which is a real killer for this type of game since the soundtrack is such a big selling point. On the plus side, it's really cool seeing the game at double its original resolution, but call me crazy, I actually prefer the look of upscaling the lower res 240p original. At least with that, you get a bit of softness to mask things like compression artifacts in the 2D assets. I will say this though, 3D elements look amazing in this release. Being able to make out a real picture when examining an item compared to the jumble of pixels you get with the console version is pretty damn cool. And continuing this weird upward-downward trend, I noticed gradients were much smoother here, which can be seen in the pools of blood left by zombies. On top of some really great visuals, you get the expected content like unique costumes, but nothing stood out to me as outside of the ordinary. Overall, this is a relatively interesting port, and one that plays really well despite having to use a keyboard, but the hassle required to get it up and running, and the problems that come with running old games on new hardware, kind of ruins the appeal for me. Or at least that's what I would have said if it wasn't for the classic Rebirth mod by Loboto3 over on Twitter. This evil genius took RE's terribly finicky PC port and made it incredibly easy to run on modern PCs, plus a whole lot more. Chief among these improvements is the ability to run the game at your native resolution, ditching the need for your monitor or PC to scale the image up from the original 640 by 480 max. And damn, do these 3D visuals look amazing. Every 3D object in the game is impressive as hell, and thanks to the added clarity, I was able to see details and character models that I've legit never seen before. It will also run at the proper frame rate during cutscenes now, so the issue with actions getting out of sync with voices is no longer present. And on top of this, there's an option to use the higher quality, more cleaned up video files included with this Japanese PC release, but to be completely honest, I really couldn't tell the difference between the two. But the biggest news of all, or at least in my opinion, is the support for modern controllers. Thanks to this X-input support, my Xbox One controller worked right out of the gate and only required me to map the aim button to the right bumper in order to be up and running. So this is clearly the best way to play the PC version of RE, but we all know I'm not about to be this positive about something without including a few downsides. For those of you interested in giving the classic Rebirth pack a try, the only real thing getting in your way is the fact that it only works with an install of the Japanese version of the game, meaning you're either going to have to grab yourself a Japanese ISO, go through the install process, then drop in the classic Rebirth.dll, or get the contents of the install from someone like I did. Of course, there are the few graphical quirks that comes with this kind of upgrade, like shadows cancelling out some 3D mesh effects, and oddly enough, the music seems to be mixed way too loud, leading the songs in the background muffling dialogue and cutscenes. But with all this in mind, Classic Rebirth is still one of the best ways to play a quick game of RE. The high-res graphics, portability of the install folder, and ability to skip door animations makes this a joy. Sure, you may have to jump through a few hoops to get the Japanese version of the game on your PC, but once you do, you're set to go. The mod just drops in and bam, you're in. Of course, not everyone is going to have access to this stuff, which keeps me from declaring this the best way to play RE1, but the mod's developer is still supporting it, with promises to implement AI upscaled 2D assets when they become available. So those of you looking to give the PC version a try really only have one option, and it is without a doubt Classic Rebirth.
But how about you, Barry?
I have this.
And for our next stop, I want to check out something I've only recently found out about, which is really saying something. I mean, I consider myself a pretty devoted fan to the series, but just a few weeks ago was the first time I had ever heard that prototype builds of Resident Evil 1 were publicly available. I had known for ages about the changes that the game went through during development, and even the scrapped concept of having the player stick with an AI-controlled co-op partner, which seemed to have made it pretty far into development thanks to some footage that can be found. And yeah, I guess it makes sense that Capcom would have sent out unfinished builds to game magazines, industry insiders, and maybe even other employees, but it blew my mind that people were actually able to get their hands on this stuff. The available versions seem to be labeled by progress dates, and the one we're looking at today is the October 4th prototype, and man is there a lot to talk about here. Starting with the very first screen where you'll find some different character art, but once we get the gameplay started, well, that's when we get into the real trippy territory. Areas we all know like the back of our hand now have subtle changes in lighting, different layouts, and even whole new angles. Then of course there's the inventory screen, which is functionally the same but radically different in a lot of visual ways. I also noticed that door transitions are more zoomed in than usual, but only just a little bit. This being a prototype, of course key items aren't going to be in their finalized places, and some areas of the mansion are locked when they normally wouldn't be, but interestingly the opposite is also true. Zombies seem to look and act the same with the exception of one element. The Magnum that you find in this demo actually takes 2 hits to down a zombie most of the time and only decapitates them randomly. But when the first hit doesn't drop them, these zombies have an all-new animation of them being knocked back a few steps, which was really cool to see. I would have loved to have seen this happen with the Beretta, maybe on a critical hit. Other than that, the hunters seem to look subtly more different, with their red veins being much more visible. In the entrance to the outdoor area, instead of finding the Crank, you'll have Yawn to deal with, which, if you ask me, would have been a better place to have him. It makes more sense to have to fight a boss to bookend the area, since you do that in the game's other 2 locations. Anyways, this area is where the prototype ends, and I have to say this is something any Resident Evil fan should experience. I used an emulator to get footage here, but if you have the ability to, burning this game to a disc and playing it on real hardware would be absolutely amazing. Finding one of these versions isn't too hard to do nowadays, and if you love the game as much as I do, you owe it to yourself to check it out. Next up on our tour of Resident Evil's more unknown side is something I actually have a bit of prior knowledge with. After RE1 hit the market a lot harder than even Capcom had predicted, the race to port it to everything was on, and the UK-based HotGen Studios wanted to make a version on Nintendo's Game Boy Color. Only instead of taking the road most traveled, these guys aimed for a nearly 1-to-1 recreation, and Capcom, being staffed by complete idiots at the time, turned them down, trashing a nearly finished product. Well, you guys know me, and I am not one to let hard work go to waste, so let's boot this bad boy up and take a look. And right off the bat, I gotta say, this game gets high marks for how surprisingly accurate it is to the source material. All of the dialogue is transcribed straight from the PS1 original, and all of the backgrounds are ripped straight from the disc. Of course, bit crushed to hell and back, but accurate nonetheless. What I thought was the most interesting aspect was the sprite scaling going on, or should I say lack thereof. It looks like instead of scaling the pixels in our character's model, the game swaps sprites in and out depending on how near or far they are from the screen, which is a relatively convincing effect, or at least the most convincing effect possible on a Game Boy Color. There are plenty of camera angles here that are damn near impossible to properly display sprites on, leading to Barry looking like he's perpendicular to the floor in the shotgun room rescue, but again, on the hardware you really couldn't expect too much more. Jill, Chris, Wesker, Barry, and Rebecca all look odd as hell, but it's clear who they are at a glance, and the zombies look pretty spooky all things considered. Like I said before, we're looking at an unfinished prototype, but during my time with Resident Evil, I was blown away at just how much of it was actually present and playable. Sure, there's a lot of rooms that just aren't available, but hell, the save function and item boxes work properly, so that's awesome. This game was really mind-blowing seeing working on actual hardware thanks to a reproduction card and the GameCube's Game Boy player. Sure, it's really cool seeing videos of this prototype work on the internet, but you never really appreciate how cool this is until you've got a controller in your hand and you're seeing it for yourself in real time. In this build of the game, your guns have unlimited ammo, which you would assume would make for an easy time, but shooting zombies in an arena where depth perception is damn near non-existent, it's just not as easy as you might think. When a zombie latches onto you, there's no animation, but hitting the action button will throw them off. The only problem is this only knocks them back one step, so they're back on you in around the time it takes to fire one shot. Compounding this problem is the fact that zombies won't follow you out of the camera zone they're placed in, but you also can't shoot them if they're not on screen, which means you can lead a zombie right up to a screen transition and they'll just sit there ready to grab you as soon as you trigger that transition again. Problems I would definitely have loved to see fixed if this was an official release. And I very, very much wish it was. Resident Evil's formula just makes a lot of sense here. I can't say why, but it just feels right, thanks to some wizardry the devs were able to pull off. Is it perfect? Hell no, but man do I wish we were able to see what they could have done with Capcom's okay to finish the product. Oh well though, there's no use crying over promising games that never got released. At least we're able to try this one out for ourselves, and that's exactly what I recommend you do. Obviously, you can't expect a full retail experience here, but instead you can look forward to a nearly broken look at what an alternate future could have looked like. A very, very fun, awesome, super cool alternate future.
That's why having stars nosing about is so inconvenient.
Well, that was one flawed experiment, you could say, but this is Capcom here. They're not just going to let one failed portable RE keep them down. Right around the game's 10th anniversary, our favorite genre-defining experience was ported to the only console around at the time that could handle such raw power. And that's, obviously, the Nintendo DS? Yeah, it's not just you, none of us had any idea what they were thinking either. But despite a tiny bit of anti-Nintendo bias on my part, I had a copy of this bad boy day one. And well, I have more than a few things to say on the subject, but before we get into that, I do have to address the elephant in the room here. I'm going to be using footage from an emulator for this portion. Now, I know I could just film my DS, but I don't think you guys came here for some early 2000s tier nonsense. I always strive to make sure you guys get to see these games running on the hardware they were developed for, but even though it pains me to say this, there's just some consoles I can't run through my FrameMeister. Well, the good news is, emulator or not, this is an absolutely mind-blowing port of the game. No, really, it might very well be my favorite. All of the original trappings of RE1's gameplay are present and accounted for here, but with some major improvements to speak of. For one, my beloved quick turn has been implemented, an addition that could be argued as messing with the balance of the game. But hey, I'm not so much of a purist that I can't admit when something can be done to improve a work of art. On top of that, a little influence from RE4 can be seen here, with the left shoulder button bringing out your character's knife, regardless of whether or not it's in your inventory. Which is great for conserving ammo, but it's not even the best new feature. Taking advantage of the console's second screen, Deadly Silence has the game's map available at a glance at all times, which means no more heading to the menu and selecting it when you want to plot out your course. And the coolest thing is, it even tracks your position in real time. These two features alone make this easily the most playable version of Resident Evil for newcomers and experienced vets alike. And yeah, you could argue these make the game a little too easy, but I think that's fine. We've all had time to best the original versions of the game, and hell, no one's forcing you to actually use them. Plus, things like this make the game perfect for the console's portable nature. But I will say not everything is an improvement here. There are some changes that are just kind of odd. Like here, Richard has a completely different voice actor than any other version of the game.
Jill, this house is dangerous.
This bothered the hell out of me, and after doing some research, I still haven't been able to figure out why. I mean, every other voice actor in the game is true to the originals, so why not this one? There's an additional touch-friendly campaign here with a CPR minigame featuring Richard. This means they needed new lines for him, and RE vets will probably notice this new voice actor made his way into the main game, but this doesn't bother me too much. Other than that, we have a different voice when starting a new game, and while I love the OG announcer, this one's pretty good too.
Resident Evil DS.
Like I said before, there's the added touchscreen and microphone additions that Nintendo's little portable was known for, but I really never cared for these gimmicks. If that's what you're looking for though, start up Rebirth mode for all the touch controls and altered puzzles your heart desires. Which leaves the normal mode for purists like me, but I think the word normal is underselling things a bit, as this is the most complete and content-rich game of Resident Evil you're ever gonna play. All the content found in any ports can be found here, sadly minus the twin gold tyrants. Visually speaking, and I know I'm going to get a few eye rolls here and no, I'm not being sarcastic, I think this game looks incredible, at least for what it's running on. Again, we're using an emulator here, but as an owner of the game I can confirm it's equally as impressive on the DS's sharp little screens. They even added new models for the zombies which really improve on the original design while sticking to that old PS1 aesthetic. The pre-rendered backgrounds can look blocky as hell thanks to a lower color depth, but once again, on the console's small screen, this is masked a bit. Graphically speaking, this is probably the best scenario we ever could have wished for on a portable device like the Nintendo DS, and I'm blown away that it looks this good on the hardware it had to work with. Listen, I've been going on forever, and the point I'm really trying to make here is that this port is absolutely amazing. It is the definitive version of the game. Go out and play it right now, or else, I guess. Well guys, I think we can finally put this one to rest. Now that we've covered every major release of RE1, it's time to lay out which version you should be trying to get your hands on, and I have to say this was a very hard decision to make. It seems like each variant of the game could serve a very specific purpose, but in the end I have to recommend newcomers play the PS1 original first. Now, that's not the cop-out it sounds like. I actually still have further recommendations, but I think a lot of the nuance in these ports will be lost on a person who wasn't already familiar with the base game. Okay, so let's say you're already a seasoned vet. Which port of Resident Evil needs to occupy your next mandatory RE playthrough? Well, I have to obviously go with the Nintendo DS version. Not only is it absolutely amazing seeing this game run so well on such limited hardware, but the additions from newer games like a quick turn and dedicated knife button legitimately improve the core experience. Typically with a portable iteration like this, there needs to be some fat trimmed first, but RE1 on the DS is damn near perfect. Most of the alterations are of the graphical variety, and even though it might be sacrilege, I think I like the zombies here more than the original. As for the version you should try your damnedest to stay away from, Well, that honor goes without question to the Windows 95 port. This thing was a major pain in my ass to get working, and that's with the help of a guy who's gotten it to work a few times before. Aside from a cool looking piece of shelf art, this box isn't worth a cent in my opinion, but other than that headache, I think every version of this game is well worth playing for two very specific reasons. First off, each one delivers a slightly different experience, and I'm sure that's not going to be lost on those of you who know the original like the back of your hands. And secondly, well, it's not like there's a wealth of other survival horror games out there begging for your attention. So yeah, I guess I'm gonna be that Resident Evil fanboy and say the only bad way to play RE1 is to not play it at all. Well guys, many thanks for not burning me alive when I failed to mention any of these in my original video, and as usual, I hope to see all of you again right here on the Resident Evil Retrospective. Hey guys, thanks for coming back. If you want to check out the rest of the retrospective, I have it linked here on screen, and maybe think about checking out my Patreon to support more projects like this. Oh, and there's one other thing. Go out and accomplish something today. Big or small, just go do something. I want everyone who hangs out here to feel good about themselves, so get out there. You got some work to do.